results-oriented evaluation is actually really, really bad for digging down into how do you get the signal out? How do you figure out what part of the decision is good and should be repeated and reinforced, and what parts of the decision should you change, and what was due to luck and what was due to skill? Because basically, I think about the outcomes as creating kind of a gravity well that pulls everything else into it and overshadows anything else you can see. So if we go back to the Pete Carroll example, I think that this shows you why that is. If I tell you this decision and I tell you that the ball was intercepted, it's like you can't see past that. It becomes like almost like a visual illusion. Like you're looking at, these lines, and you cannot help but see one line is longer, no matter whether those lines are exactly the same length or not. And because you know the outcome, you cannot help but see the decision as poor, and your mind will work to make it fit with the quality of the outcome. Your mind will work to make that decision make sense as a bad decision, to go with the bad outcome. And then when I give you the thought experiment and I say, well, imagine that the ball was caught for a touchdown, it just becomes the opposite. And it's like, okay, now your mind goes into overdrive trying to make it, to give all the reasons why it's a good decision. The thing that I think that's kind of counterintuitive, you really want to understand why something happened. What was the contribution of luck and skill? How do you dig down into what's the signal and what's the noise?
Welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better, where we explore how you can apply insights from visionary leaders and the most provocative philosophers and scientists of our time to make your life and our world a better place. Here's your host, author and speaker, Paul Gibbons.
Hey, welcome back to Think Bigger, Think Better. So a lot of what we talk about on Think Bigger, Think Better is about decisions. That is thinking better. And today's podcast with Annie Duke is on decision-making under uncertainty. But first, I want to thank everybody for listening. Thanks for your support on Facebook, Patreon, Twitter, or wherever. Please share if you find the podcast interesting and valuable. We have some amazing guests coming up this summer. We will have shows on depression, addiction, and very soon with Jeremy Hyman's, author of the superb book, New Power. But first, let's talk a little bit about poker. I started playing poker in 2009 and delved right into it, getting a coach, discussing poker with other professionals, and reading everything that was available. I got reasonably good, and for a few years after I sold my business, I turned pro. I still play, and every summer I trudge to Vegas for 6 weeks to play the World Series of Poker. I would not say that I'm one of the best players in the world, but for the over 55s, not too humbly, I'd say I'm probably in the top 100. I have been ranked as highly as 700 out of all players in the world. So I go to Vegas in the hope of winning a world championship bracelet, which there's enough randomness in poker where, one day that's something that I'm a kid with a dream, as we say in the poker world. So how is poker relevant to life? And how is poker relevant to thinking better? And how can understanding a little bit about how poker works help you make decisions in life? Well, here it is in one line. Poker is about decisions that are probabilistic and made with imperfect information. That's worth repeating. Poker is about decisions that are probabilistic and made with imperfect information. So what do I mean? In poker, you can make the best decision. Say somebody bets all in, and you have 2 queens, which is a pretty strong hand. You judge, this is the imperfect information part, since you can't see what they actually have, that you have the best hand enough of the time to call. You can't be sure. They might have king, or ace, but on balance, the math said you're ahead of the distribution of hands they might have. So you call. They have jack, and you're a 4-1 favorite. But the flop brings a jack and you lose. You made the best decision, but lost. The temptation that bad players fall into in life and in poker is to say, that was a bad decision. The other temptation, the great cognitive error, is when you attribute your winnings to skill, but when you lose, you attribute it to luck. Great players do the opposite. People who gamble for a living on Wall Street, for example, tend to attribute their success to their magnificent wisdom and foresight, making them not always the most pleasant company. But when the market goes against them, luck is to blame. So enough about poker. Everything I've just said about poker equally applies to life. Life is full of probabilistic decisions made with imperfect information. In the words of the great Prussian general von Clausewitz, who wrote the preeminent book on military strategy, Vom Kriege, on war, strategy is fog, friction, chance. The fog is ambiguity. Friction is the loss of momentum from real-world slippages, and chance is random events that dramatically shift outcomes. The modern recasting of this is called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You don't know how the market will behave. You don't know how competitors will respond. You don't know whether the college course you take will land you a rewarding career. You don't know how employees will react to a new strategy. Yet we tend to think about the world in terms of certainties and patterns. We like to be sure, but that confidence is misplaced. We have cognitive biases which cloud our judgment. We see the world imperfectly, we react emotionally and impulsively, and we use mental shortcuts called heuristics that may not always provide the best answers. Not only that, we pretend the world is full of certainties. Which executive strategy pitch sounds like 33% of the time we'll be wildly successful, 50% of the time we'll break even, but the rest of the time we'll lose our shirts? Well, that's reality. And although venture capitalists tend to talk that way, business professionals, business strategists on the whole do not. The other mistake that we make is we deal with probability distributions by reducing the degrees of freedom. What does that mean? That's the simplification you make when you take a distribution of probabilities and replace it with a single number, an average ROI, or an average ROC, or an average margin. But that is also a terrible mistake. If you can't swim, crossing a river that's an average of 4 feet deep is a very bad idea. The whole distribution of depths of the river tells you how risky it will be, not the average. And so business is like that, and life is like that. There's more gamble in life. Choosing a career, a strategy, or a golf shot depends partly on luck, on how the world turns out, and we can't control that. That's why today's guest, Annie Duke, is in great demand by businesses, hedge funds, and venture capitalist firms to talk about the science of non-predictive decision-making. And that's why I invited her to discuss her new book, Thinking in Bets. So who is Annie? She started life as an academic, but moved to Montana to start a family and started making money in smoke-filled poker rooms in Montana. Soon, she got good. She got really good. And for 2 decades, Annie was one of the top poker players in the world. In 2004, she won a World Series bracelet, besting a field of 234 players. Now, she combines her academic career as a cognitive scientist with her prowess as a poker player and is in great demand, again, by hedge funds and venture capital firms to consult and to speak on decision-making under uncertainty. Her passion for making a difference has also helped raise millions for charitable causes. In 2006, she founded Anti-Up for Africa with Don Cheadle and Norman Epstein. It's raised more than $4 million for Africans in need. She's also served on the board of the Decision Education Foundation, and in 2009, she appeared on The Celebrity Apprentice and raised almost $750,000 for Refugees International, a charity that advocates for refugees around the world. So an academic, a speaker, a professional poker player, a consultant, and also a philanthropist we have with us today, Annie Duke. Annie, welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
So here we go. I'm going to have to ask you. So I'm getting ready for the World Series of Poker. I'm studying, and I've got a huge schedule, 6 weeks of poker tournaments, insanity. How about you? Are you going to be there or not this year?
So I actually fully retired in 2012. That's actually the last time I played. So the answer is no. The poker that I play now is really just mainly for charity. So poker's a wonderful way to raise money for charity. As soon as poker became kind of popular on TV, people started using it for like charity poker tournaments. And so I've been doing that since like 2002. So I didn't retire from that part of poker, but I haven't played in the World Series since 2012.
Oh, that's a bummer. That'd be so awesome to have you there. Anyway, maybe one day. Life is long.
It's like any career. I mean, I did it from, well, I started playing for money in 92 and really became kind of a professional in 94. And then this weird thing happened, which was in 2002. So I had originally started off my life as an academic. I was getting my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in cognitive science and fully intended to become a professor. And, just ended up kind of taking this left turn into poker. And then in 2002, this guy named Roger Lowe, who I'm very grateful for, asked me to come and speak to a group of his options traders. Actually, he asked Eric Seidel to do it, and Eric Seidel doesn't like public speaking. So he recommended me. And I came and gave this talk to this group of traders. And from there, Roger I liked what I did and started referring me out. And it was this moment in time where I had to sort of merge what I had thought of, what I'd been thinking about in graduate school in terms of cognitive science and decision making and learning, with how poker might sort of bolster that and inform it and refine it in a way that I could communicate it to other people. And it was this really beautiful collision of the two things that I was very passionate about up until that point in my adult life, which was poker and science. And I started developing a speaking career. So I was doing that. It's just people didn't kind of know that I had this career the whole time. And by the time 2012 rolled around, it was actually a very big part of my life. And then, in 2011, as you know, the poker economy really collapsed and really started contracting. There was obviously my brother had some stuff with that collapse and the DOJ shutting online poker down because he was associated with Full Tilt, which got shut down. And then I had a company called Epic Poker that was a startup trying to sort of create a PGA of poker, and that failed. And, it just was a really unhappy time. It was also right around, my mother died at that time too. It was like a lot of stuff happening in my life. And I kind of looked around at my life and I was like, what am I getting joy from? Like, what am I really happy doing right now? And the speaking, it's, the thing about speaking is it's so completely the opposite of zero sum.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's great. I got into poker when you were getting out of it. So I started playing seriously. I got a coach in 2009, and then I briefly turned pro in 2011, 2012, meaning that just I played full time. And now, quite frankly, until I write a New York Times bestseller, which, nets me $5 million and $100,000 speaking fees, which may not happen. Let's face it. A lot of people would like that.
Even if you get a New York Times bestseller, do you make $5 million? Like,
I don't know. I don't know what you make.
Writing books is not a way to get rich. I'm just for everybody.
I call it my get poor quick scheme.
Yes, exactly.
My book's enormously successful. It's like number 3 in organizational change. The income's like in the thousands. I make that in 20 minutes playing poker.
Exactly. It's like really good for buying some mac and cheese, I guess James Comey's probably making $1 gazillion from his book. But for most of us, this is stuff that's, our passion.
Yeah, I know. People told me there wouldn't be much money in writing books. I was like, yeah, but mine's going to do really well. Well, it did do really well. There's still no money in it. Anyway, tell listeners something that's a little funky about Annie, something slightly quirky or eccentric or something slightly weird off the beaten track about you.
First of all, I think that most listeners would find it quirky that I played poker for a living for 18 years.
I suppose. But I suppose you're already out there. So how much further out there can you go, right?
Well, okay. So I'll tell you, I'm a vegan.
All right, that's cool.
Yeah, that's probably quirky. Oh, here's something that people probably wouldn't expect from Annie Duke. I am an avid watcher of the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, Orange County, and New York. I don't watch the other ones, but those 3 I actually watch quite regularly and really enjoy them. I watch a lot of I read a lot of really intellectual stuff, and I I watch a lot of the really great TV shows, but I also really like The Housewives. I don't know. There you go.
I gotta say, like, I have all these nonfiction books. I buy books, 3 or 4 books a week, and read this heavy duty stuff. And I'm addicted to Homeland right now, which is my, it's like it's like bubble gum. Yeah, it's like bubble gum. What bubble gum is to nutrition, Homeland is to entertainment in a way. But
okay, so I'm a couple of episodes behind, but I just want to ask you a question because it's been bothering me. So, obviously, last season the president, arrests everybody in the CIA.
Hold on, I'm on season 3. Do not spoil. Do not spoil for me.
I stop. I do not speak. I am sorry.
Listen, this is all like, anyway.
I thought you were caught up.
And I had a friend who's like, no, I was in the middle of season 1, and a friend of mine who I persuaded on Facebook, I said it was a good show and people should watch it. I didn't want to watch it because it seemed to me to be slightly racist, but so was 24 and all these things. All the Muslims are bad guys, the little sweet little old lady Muslim shopkeeper next door or something like that. So, a child I didn't want to watch it, but it's actually very compelling. And I said, I can't believe that Brody jumped whatever the Claire Danes character is called. And my friends called me a jerk because he was on episode 1, and I was on episode 3, and I ruined it for him.
Oh no! Well, ignore anything I just said. But Homeland is amazing. It's one of my favorite shows.
It is. It is compelling stuff. So, all right, let's get on to cognitive science and decision making under uncertainty and all of that kind of stuff. Cool. So, there's a guy called Peter Drucker, famous management theorist, maybe the most famous management and leadership theorist, and he said leadership is all about results. And in business, most managers are exalted to focus on results, and careers are broken on short-term results. If you're a banker and a big trade goes well, that can make your career. If it goes badly, look for another job perhaps. And the same with big projects. So anyway, let me ask you this, Addie. What mistake are people making when they talk about results the way they do?
Yeah, so I think that what we want to do, and you gave a little clue in there, is there's a difference between short-term results and long-term results. In the same sense that there's a difference between one coin flip and 10,000 coin flips. If we do like 4 coin flips and I ask you to call it, and you call heads and it lands heads 4 times, I'm like, oh, that was unusual, but okay, that's fine. He got kind of lucky. But if we flip it 10,000 times and somehow you call heads correctly, 9,000 of those times, now I can say that, okay, there's something going on with this Paul guy. Right? So I think that the problem is that in the short run, and for most things in life, we generally don't have enough data to say anything particularly valuable from just looking at results. And this idea that we're supposed to be results oriented is actually really counterproductive to making sure that we're good decision makers. So there's 2 problems here.
The Monday morning quarterback, something you're very good at is talking about sports. I know nothing about sports, but you start the book with a great sports example, which I think is really illustrative. You can tell it better than me. What's the story there?
Sure. So this is the first problem with resulting, which is that in general, what we do is we really connect together much too tightly the quality of the outcome or the quality of the result with the quality of the decision making. So a very famous example, and then actually I can give you another example that's not sports related that's really recently in the news. But the famous example that I opened the book with is Pete Carroll and the Seahawks are on the 1-yard line of the New England Patriots. And it's
the Seahawks are a football team, so are the Patriots, right? Is that right?
Yes, they're both NFL teams, and it is the Super Bowl. And they're on the 1-yard line, which means they are 1 yard away from scoring out of 100 yards available. It happens to be the last play, the last few seconds, rather, of the game. So the Seahawks are down by 4. A touchdown gets you 6 points. So obviously, if they can score a touchdown here in the last 26 seconds, it's very likely they'll win the game because the Patriots won't have enough time to march it back down the field. So this is a really, really important moment, obviously, in this game. And the Seahawks have a player named Marshawn Lynch, who is a very, very good short yardage running back. And they're expecting that Pete Carroll's going to hand this ball off to Marshawn Lynch. But instead, he calls a pass play. Russell Wilson, the quarterback, passes the ball. and it's intercepted in the end zone by a guy named Malcolm Butler. So,
and that's end of game, GG, as we say in the gaming world.
Yeah, GG. So what ends up happening is you can hear Chris Collingsworth actually calling the play, just saying like, oh my God, this is such a horrible play. This is ridiculous. And then the next day, the Monday morning quarterbacks, as you said, didn't disagree. So when you looked at the headlines, pretty much across the board, it seemed to be an argument about whether it was the worst play call in Super Bowl history or the worst play call in football history, period. So right. There wasn't any disagreement that it was a horrible play call. And when Pete Carroll was asked about it, what he said was that he agreed that it was the worst result of a call ever. And I think that that's a really important distinction because
nobody makes that distinction.
Right.
Nobody makes that distinction.
Just because it was a disastrous result doesn't mean it was a disastrous decision. And there's a really easy way to be able to see into that, which is, and across the board, when I ask people to do this, people really have the same reaction. I say, okay, so imagine that Pete Carroll.
But how could you say that they lost? That's the thing that people say, oh, well, how could you say it was a good decision? They lost.
Right. So, and this is what I tell them. I say, imagine that Pete Carroll called that same pass play. Malcolm Butler passes the ball. I mean, not Malcolm Butler. Russell Wilson passes the ball, and it's caught for a touchdown in the end zone, the game-winning touchdown in the end zone. What do you think about that play now? And people actually, they'll straight out say, well, then it would be a great play. And I say, well, the way that it turned out doesn't actually have anything to do with whether the decision quality was good. Not on that one time. We're not running a Monte Carlo here. So the fact that you're being so swung around by whether the result was good or bad in terms of your analysis of the decision tells you what's going on here, tells you what's wrong.
So how much are we doing that? I mean, how much are we taking results off a single data point or a small number of data points, of 4 coin tosses or something like that, and trying to draw these abstract general conclusions from them? A lot, right?
I think pretty much all the time.
Right.
The only time that we kind of don't do it is when there's really, really, really strong consensus about whether the decision is a good one or not. So the example that I would give would be like if you run a red light and you don't happen not to get in an accident, I don't think people are taking that as a signal that running a red light is good, just because there's so much consensus about sort of what the correct decision is there. So you have to have a lot of consensus around it. But for most decisions, you can't kind of see down into the quality of the decision. We can't really see into what it looks like. And what's kind of happening here is that people are behaving as if life's decisions are really like decisions that you'd make in chess. Because in chess, if we play a game and you beat me, that means you made better decisions than I did. And if we play a game and you lose to me, it's because you made worse decisions than I did. And the reason why I can say that with confidence is because chess is missing something that life has, and that poker has as well, which is a very strong element of luck and hidden information. So in chess, I can see your whole position. I can see all the pieces on the board, and there's very little luck. I mean, at least not in the sense that somebody like rolls the dice and then it comes up, 9, and that means that I get to take your bishop off the board. So because you don't have those elements that really inject a lot of uncertainty into the process, what that means is that there's a very tight connection between the quality of the outcome and the quality of the decision making. But that's not true in life. In poker, I can have the very best hand, like aces. I can play the hand perfectly, and I can still lose. And I can have the very worst hand, and I can play it like crap, and I can still win. And that's because there's this uncertainty element, which you see in this Pete Carroll decision. So just so that people, I won't get into the detailed statistics. If people want to read about why.
No, there is something interesting though. But you said that interception, that pass that was intercepted, that's only intercepted. I think, did you say one time is about 2%, right?
Well,
a 1 yard pass.
Yeah, it's somewhere between 1% and 2%. So in that season, in that situation, passes had intercepted in that situation 0 times. Over the course of 15 seasons. But I mean, it's kind of unclear whether you're supposed to aggregate across 15 seasons because coverage has changed. But even if you did, so the worst is 2%. Sort of, if you take sort of the outer bound of how often is that going to get interception? It would be 2%, but I don't think you should aggregate across 15 seasons. So
it's 3 times less likely than a spin of a roulette wheel. So for listeners, a roulette wheel is 1 in 37, roughly speaking, which is around 3%. So it's less than that. It's like 2%. So if you think about it, if you go to a roulette wheel and you put the money on your birthday or number 8, you're going to lose 36 times out of 37. And this was that 37th time. So that gives, I think, listeners an idea about how improbable it was that would go precisely that way.
Right. And so one would hope that we don't think someone made a bad decision because something that was 1% to happen happened. And there were a lot of actually good things that came from that decision. The main thing is that the 2 running plays that you would get in if you hand it off to Marshawn Lynch, by passing the ball, you actually get those 2 running plays anyway because, obviously if the ball is caught for a touchdown, you're done. But when the ball isn't caught for a touchdown, when it's dropped, it stops the clock and gives you enough time for those 2 running plays. So, but if people want to, read sort of more of the math, they can either read my book or they can go to 538. A guy named Benjamin Morris actually wrote quite a bit about this. And there's another guy, Brian Butler, who wrote for Slate, who actually went into some really good analysis of this. I think the be all and end all, though, is that Bill Belichick thinks the play was brilliant.
I don't know who he is. He could be a reality television star as far as I'm concerned.
Bill Belichick is the coach of the New England Patriots. They're the one that won the game. And Bill Belichick has 5 Super Bowl rings. So let's call Bill Belichick a really, really good coach. And he was actually the opposing coach for that play. And he's actually very strongly defended that play.
Now, that's interesting, but are we falling into the same trap? If we say he has 5 Super Bowl rings, therefore he's a very good coach, are we following into this results trap?
No, because,
or is that enough data?
Because he's got a long enough record.
He's got a long enough record. I will say that poker players who play online, they talk about 20,000, but there are people who win, they put a couple $100 online and they win and win and win and win and win. But a professional poker player who's an online poker player doesn't have a reliable sample of poker hands until he's reached like 50,000 hands.
That's right.
And so this is the wonderful thing about poker. And this is why that the poker economy remains as strong as it is because there's enough luck in the game. So somebody who is quite poor at the game is going to win often enough. And sometimes they'll do it mostly because they're not very good. They'll get their money in terrible. And they'll win an improbable result. And they'll feel like heroes. There's enough dopamine surging through their system there that keeps them coming back and also persuades them that they're much better than they are. Because in poker, you put down all of your success is due to, of course, your beautiful arcane skill and deep knowledge of the game. And every time you lose, you're unlucky, which is a lot of the ways that people think about life, right?
Yeah. So I think that you actually just dug down into something really important. So obviously with Belichick, he's been coaching for so long and he has so many wins under his belt, not just Super Bowls, but, making it to the playoffs and what his, record is and whatnot, that we can say something about his coaching skill. But not for most people, right? Like, as you said, like you need a lot of hands under your belt before you can start saying anything interesting. And the reason is that there's so much luck and there's so much hidden information involved. So there's a reason why chess is not a huge gambling game.
And nobody watches it except for me. I mean, I watch it every day, but there's not that thrill.
Yes, right. If you're better than me in chess, even by just a little bit, you're going to win all the time. You're going to win all the time. So why would I ever gamble against you? But in something where there's luck and hidden information, so there's lots and lots of uncertainty that creates this, disconnection, this very loose relationship between decisions and outcomes. What ends up happening is that when you lose, it's very hard to see into why. I mean, I think that this is kind of the interesting thing. So with resulting, we're not evaluating our own outcomes, right? We're just sort of looking at Pete Carroll and we're saying, like, did he do a good job or not? And we can't see down into what was the information that he had when he made that decision and how much luck is involved. Nobody's flashing a sign that says 1% on the screen for me. Right? I can't see it. So now I've got to go back in and try to sort of figure this out. Like, was it a bad decision? Or was it due to these elements that were kind of outside of his control? And because I'm not emotionally invested in Pete Carroll in the same way, like I just look at that and I say, well, if it's a bad outcome, it must be a bad decision. If it's a good outcome, it must be a good decision. But with ourselves, what we do is something a little bit different. The way that we sort of dig in to this disconnection between outcomes and decisions is we turn it around to make ourselves feel better about our outcomes. So what does that mean that happens? And this is what you just got to with this luck element in poker. If I win in poker, then I attribute it to the skill elements of the game, right? The things that I did. If I lose in poker, I can say there's enough rope that the uncertainty gives me that I can say, oh, it was just luck. And I can't do that in chess. If I lose to you in chess, I can't say, man, I can't believe how lucky Paul is. He's so lucky.
That's right. Yeah, he was so lucky. Yes. You know, it's interesting. So just for listeners, I just want to say to listeners, first of all, Annie's book is not a poker book, not by a long straw. It's you could call it on business or personal development or business strategy. You could say, or decision making under uncertainty. So it's more likely to be reviewed in the Harvard Business Review than in Poker News.
Yeah, I had a very nice review in the Wall Street Journal. So
that's great. Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. So I'm jealous. I didn't get reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. And so I do want to say that. And I do want to say also that there are a couple of books which from 10 years ago, there was a book called Fooled by Randomness by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who he's a Wall Street guy like me, former Wall Street guy, recovering Wall Street guy. And, he basically says in that book that traders are deluding themselves. He says that most of us are deluding. Most of the successful people are deluding themselves, that somehow their success in life, whether that be wealth or fame, is due to their, consummate talent and hard work. And Taleb says, well, actually, you're more likely to be a lucky son of a gun than you are to be as talented or hardworking. Certainly not as talented and hardworking as you think you are, where you were born and what schools, what advantages you have in life, where you were, all of that kind of stuff is stuff that we quickly discount, the sort of luck element. And we think, aren't I clever? Much as the newbie poker player does with the poker hand. So that's another book. And then you also mentioned 538.com, Nate Silver, who's written a book called The Signal and the Noise. And you could call these short-term results, you could call them the noise. And what you talk about a lot in your book, which is wonderful, is the signal and how to get the signal, the real information that helps you make a decision from the noise. Do you want to talk about that, or?
Yeah. So let me just circle back a little bit to, there's very little poker in the book. And in terms of this issue of bad results aren't my fault, good results, are to my credit. It's called self-serving bias. And just to give an idea, anybody who has children will understand how prevalent this is because, my son would come home from school and when he'd have a good grade, it would, I'm so brilliant. And are you going to take me out to a special dinner to celebrate, the genius of your child? When he came home with a bad grade, it was, the teacher doesn't like me. And there was stuff on the test that he didn't teach in class and the test was really hard and nobody did well on it. And
it's so unfair. And my child's the same way.
You can ask anybody. So just listen to your kids talk and you're going to see that this is incredibly, or listen to somebody who gets passed over for promotion. By the way, I don't think I've ever heard someone in that say, oh, I just didn't work hard enough. That other person really deserved it more than I did. Go find the person who said that, by the way, because you should hire them into your company if you find them.
Absolutely right. That's what Carol Dweck, you don't talk about the growth mindset in your book, but I'm sure you've read it. But that's actually the growth mindset,
right?
As you've just described. Yeah,
exactly. So I just think that, it's really important to understand this is the main pattern of how we think. Now, what I think is really interesting is that to what you just asked me, which is, how do you dig down into the signal? How do you get to the decision quality? The answer is a little bit paradoxical and it's twofold. Piece number one is don't try to do it on your own because these biases that we have are so strong. And we always want to be telling this really good story about ourselves. We're really good PR agents for ourselves. And to sort of borrow actually from John Haidt and Wonderful book. So we're really good at sort of like being advertisers for ourselves, and we don't really even know we're doing it. And the thing is that the smarter you are, actually the better you are at telling a story that makes sense for it not to have to do with, your own skill, that you have a bad outcome. And if you know about these biases, you'll just tell a story that's better for that, right? That's like, well, and I've been thinking about whether it's just self-serving bias, and here's why it's not. So you'll sort of wrap that into your narrative. Now, that's not to say if you know about these biases and you're trying, you will do it a little bit less, but it's really just going to be a little bit less, because we're very, very good at messing up at this. The good news is, though, that, and I think that you'll agree, is that it's like immediately obvious when somebody else is engaging in a biased analysis, right? So when your friend comes home and is like, man, I can't believe didn't get that promotion because my boss is a jerk, and obviously I'm great and I deserved it, and that other person doesn't know what they're doing and they're terrible at their job, and it was just because of, the boss likes them better. In your head, you're like, come on. Like you're not right. So if you can get other people involved in helping you and kind of watching your back for you, and you agree to watch their back, that's actually kind of piece number one, is get some other people involved in the process, so that, because they're going to give you perspective. But the other thing, and I think that this is counterintuitive, and it goes back to where we started the conversation, which is that results-oriented evaluation is actually really, really bad for digging down into how do you get the signal out? How do you figure out what part of the decision is good and should be repeated and reinforced, and what parts of the decision should you change, and what was due to luck and what was due to skill? Because basically, I think about the outcomes as creating kind of a gravity well that pulls everything else into it and overshadows anything else you can see. So if we go back to the Pete Carroll example, I think that this shows you why that is. If I tell you this decision and I tell you that the ball was intercepted, it's like you can't see past that. It becomes like almost like a visual illusion. Like you're looking at, these lines, and you cannot help but see one line is longer, no matter whether those lines are exactly the same length or not. And because you know the outcome, you cannot help but see the decision as poor, and your mind will work to make it fit with the quality of the outcome. Your mind will work to make that decision make sense as a bad decision, to go with the bad outcome. And then when I give you the thought experiment and I say, well, imagine that the ball was caught for a touchdown, it just becomes the opposite. And it's like, okay, now your mind goes into overdrive trying to make it, to give all the reasons why it's a good decision. The thing that I think that's kind of counterintuitive, you really want to understand why something happened. What was the contribution of luck and skill? How do you dig down into what's the signal and what's the noise? You have to separate yourself from the outcome. So how do you do that? Well, one obvious way you can do that is to do as much analysis of the decision process before the outcome is known, if it's possible. Which you can do, like, for example, like if you're a trial lawyer, you can do as much analysis as possible of the trial strategy before you get the verdict, right? So that's something. But in a lot of things, that's not practical. Obviously, in poker, that's not practical because the results come too fast. So then what do you do? Well, with this group of people that you've put together, there's a variety of ways that you can get the outcome, that you can sort of get the shadow of the outcome away. One way is, like, if I'm describing a problem that I have where I need help with a decision, I describe it up only to the decision point and no further. So in poker, for example, I might say, I had ace queen and I opened the pot for a raise, and this guy re-raised me, and let me tell you a whole bunch of facts about this guy and the way he'd been playing, whether he's loose or tight or aggressive or not aggressive. And so anyway, and then I called, and, the board came, queen something, and now I wasn't sure what to do. Right. And I stopped there. And now I ask your advice. What do you think I should have done in that spot? And obviously, I've already played the hand. I know what the outcome is. I know what my choice was. I know what the other person's response was. I know all of those things, but I've hidden them from your view so that they don't cast a shadow over the way that you analyze that decision. Because once I tell you the outcome, I've now infected you, like with a virus.
Yes.
So that's one thing you can do, is just only describe the decision. And you can do this in anything, whether you're in sales or you're asking a decision about like child rearing, or, it's a career decision or a project management decision or a product launch decision or whatever it might be. Ask only up to the point where you have a question, where the question is, and don't discuss anything beyond that, because it will give too much color. So that's one thing you can do.
So it will color their. If people know how it turns out, they'll color their analysis.
They'll retrofit. They'll make it make sense.
And so, because we want to justify how.
Yeah. So then you just lose fidelity, and basically you lose the ability to pull the signal out, because you lose fidelity in the advice. The other thing that you can do, which is kind of interesting, is you can work the decision with one group of people where you tell them that the outcome was good. And you can work the decision with another group of people where you tell them that the outcome was bad. So what you're going to get from the group that you tell the outcome was good was all the things that they think were probably pretty good about the decision. So you're going to get that sort of side of the story from them. And then the other group where you've told them the outcome is bad, they're going to pull out all the weaknesses in the decision process. And then you can then sort of combine those together to figure out what's what. So
I like that. That's a good one. I kind of like that. Actually, it hadn't occurred to me before.
Well, there you go. There you go. You can use that. So that's another way to do it. So, but all of it is separate people from the outcomes. And I want to also just make really clear that a type of outcome that we have in our lives is beliefs that we have. So you can think about, you have some sort of process where you're analyzing information, and what's the outcome of the information analysis is you form a belief. So you can also infect people with your own beliefs. So particularly if you're in a leadership role, I'll give you a simple example. There's 4 candidates that you're just trying to decide among to hire, and you're in a leadership role and you're trying to get advice from the people in the room and their opinions about who they want to hire. If you tell them your preferred candidate first, you might as well not even ask them their opinions, because you've infected them with, that's an outcome in itself. You've already infected them with that.
Well, or one way or another, but one way or another, you'll bias them. One way I'm going to show him, or I'm going to become oppositional, or people who think that way, but you also might, certainly. But that's really great. Listen, what, from the learning domain, and we can generalize this to business in a minute. Like, what is the difference between the way good poker players learn and noobs learn, or don't learn precisely? And how can business people make use of that?
Yeah, so
I mean, we've been into this a little bit already. I think your story about Eric Seidel, maybe that's worth recounting, as when you were a young new poker player and you came to Eric Seidel with this horrible bad beat story where the cards had spat in your face or something like that, as all poker players do, and Eric's like, not interested. So that's like maybe a good place to start. Maybe, I don't know, possibly.
Yeah. So here's the thing, that there's a wonderful book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman. And in it, he talks about this idea that we all want to have a positive narrative of our lives. Like when we're recounting our lives, we want the narrative to be a positive one. So what ends up happening is that when you ask me, like, how do most people learn? It's that while most people have a goal of, I want to learn and I want to become better at this game, part of what's involved in that is being willing to admit when you make mistakes. Because if you don't admit when you make mistakes, then obviously you're not going to fix those. But that is in direct conflict with what Kahneman said, which is that we want to sort of be always telling this positive narrative. We want to be able to update our narrative in this positive way. So what ends up happening with most people is exactly what we've been talking about, this kind of offloading of the bad results and onboarding of the good results, which really interferes with learning. Because we all sort of feel this way, what ends up happening is we go off, because everybody has groups that they talk their decisions with, whether it's at work or groups of friends or in the poker room or whatever it might be. And it tends to end up being that you just sort of are reinforcing either this luck and, this sort of bad things are bad luck and good things are, to our credit narrative, Or we also can see this, like, for example, in political discourse, where when I go and talk to people about politics, the natural tendency is to gather in groups who agree with one another and then pat everybody on the back for all of their amazing opinions. Because that's another way to not admit a mistake, right? It's like, well, we all agree that this is the way that the world is and this is correct, and here's this supporting evidence, and we're all so smart, and yay us. So it's this kind of confirmatory style that can express either in a reinforcement of beliefs that you have, a reinforcement about predictions about the way that the future is going to be, or just a reinforcement of these very self-serving narratives that, when you listen to most people in a poker room, it's like, I'm going to tell you this horrible bad luck story that I had where I lost with aces and I'm so sad. And you're going to say, yes, that's very sad. I agree with you. How horrible. Now let me tell you my story of sadness. And we all go, yes, very sad, but we're all great players.
Yes. That's right. The pity pot, the poker pity pot.
Right. And it's like this unspoken social contract. It's like, here's another thing. Like, if I'm sitting with a friend of mine and they're complaining to me about how the last 3 people that they've dated are jerks, the expectation on my part is to say, oh, yes, I'm so sorry that you're dating those jerks.
Oh, poor you.
Right. And
how does that happen to you?
Exactly. I'd be breaking the kind of normal social contract if I said, well, do you think you might just be choosing jerks? Right. And that would be considered sort of an offensive thing to say.
Well, that's what Aristotle called that a good friend. That was the definition for Aristotle of a good friend.
Right.
Someone who's prepared to say things like that.
Exactly. So what this is, going back to this idea of get a really good group of people together, go find some people to do this stuff with you, but then create an intentional contract which breaks that social contract, where it's like, Paul, you and I are going to get in this group together, and when you come tell me about all the jerks in your life, I'm going to question how you might be contributing to that. And you're going to accept that because we've agreed that this is the way that we're going to interact with each other. When the example I give is very early on in my poker career, I had known Eric Seidel, who's an amazing player who has over $38 million in tournament cashes. I mean, this guy's really good. And I'd known him since I was 16 years old, but as a friend. So now it's 10 years later, and I've now become a poker player. So I've never interacted with him sort of in a professional capacity prior to this, right?
Sure.
So I go up to him, and I lost some hand, like we all do. Like, okay, whatever. I'm sure I was telling him, like, I had aces and I lost, whatever. And he very bluntly said to me, why are you telling me the story? First of all, don't onboard your emotional damage to me. Like, I lose hands a lot too. Like, I don't want to have to deal with your emotions about it as well. And by the way, do you have a question about this hand? Because I have no interest in hearing your bad beat stories. Like, we've all lost hands. I have a lot of interest in hearing your strategy questions. So if you have a question, go right ahead. But if all you want to do is complain to me about something that was in nobody's control because the cards just didn't go your way, then all you're doing is wasting my time and you're emotionally annoying me.
Well, it's anti-learning too. What you're doing is you're adopting an unlearning or an anti-learning philosophy then. Is you're taking a bad result and attributing entirety to luck, and there's no opportunity for you to grow and learn.
Right, exactly. So, I think that people think that was a really harsh conversation, but it was actually one of the most valuable things that anybody ever said to me. And from then on, now think about how that changed my behavior. Now, I really care about Eric's respect. He's a good friend of mine. I want him to think well of me. And so just separate and apart from the poker, I want him to think well of me because he's my friend. But also I've now come into poker and he's already an incredibly well-established and great player. And I want him to think well of me as a poker player as well now. So now he's told me the rules of the game. I have to come to him with questions. I have to come to him with places where specifically I think I made a mistake or where I've watched somebody else play and I don't understand their decisions. And I want to understand what he thinks of their decisions, not in a way to say, oh, they're an idiot and just run them down, but where I'm genuinely not sure whether they played well or not because I'm confused. right? So those are the two choices I have now in terms of poker conversations with him. So what does that do to me? Now, first of all, when I do talk about those hands with him, I'm learning because I'm getting mentored. But when I go back and play poker, I'm now processing the game differently. Instead of sitting at the table and just when I lose a hand going, wah, 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 and getting sad. And when I win a hand going, look at me, I'm so great. When I'm at the table, I'm trying to collect material to now go talk to Eric about later. So I'm specifically searching for places where I think I made errors or there are things that I don't understand that are going on at the table so that I can go then talk to him about it later. So it's got this really wonderful effect of not only helping you during the interaction with the person that is in your group, where they're actually helping you deconstruct and work through decisions, but it's helping you when you're away from them as well. Because when I'm away from him, I'm approaching the game with a mind toward learning that I otherwise wouldn't be because I know I'm going to be accountable to him later for the conversation.
And you know what the next level beyond that is? And there's something that businesses make a lot. So one of the things I used to study is financial scandals, financial fraud in investment banks. And very often the place that was where the fraud happened, where Kidder Peabody or Lehman Brothers, wherever it was, there's many, many banks over the decades. And it was the place that was previously making the most money. So it was true in Baring Brothers, it's true. And that's the place where the bankers, the governance, the board, the executive committee, the risk committee felt like they could, didn't need to spend a lot of time looking under the hood at what the decision-making processes were because things were going great and we're making shit tons of money, so we don't have to worry about that. And that's precisely the same thing. And it's true. Very few poker players after a session was called, here's a hand where I stacked somebody and took all his chips, but I really think I played it like a moron. What do you think? Because we don't tend to do that. We don't tend to do that. We don't tend to do that in life. We don't tend to do that in business. We don't tend to do it in risk management. And it's called one of the things it's called is the halo effect. And we're unprepared to look at areas where things are going really well and saying, but am I making good decisions or am I just a luck box? And that's pervasively true in business. Because in business, among other things, business outcomes it's like poker. It's not quite as random, I wouldn't say, as poker, but it's more complex. So whether your product succeeds, a product launch, or whether your new business succeeds, there's 100 factors, 200 factors. So it's insanely complex, which makes it probabilistic, just like poker is.
Yeah, actually, so I tell a story. There's a narrative that I have in my book, which is, I think, really helpful with what you're talking about, where I was working with a nonprofit that I'm actually on the board of called After School All Stars. And as a board member, I was trying to help them with their, with some issues around their grant writing that just had to do with really kind of understanding from a budgeting perspective when they had applied for a slate of grants, what the expected value of those grants were. So just so that people understand, it's like if you apply for a $100,000 grant, the expected value of that grant isn't $100,000 because you're not going to get it 100% of the time. So the expected value of the grant is whatever the grant award is, which is in this case $100,000, multiplied by the percentage of time you think you're actually going to get awarded that grant. So if you think you're going to get the grant only half the time, the grant's worth, what you should be budgeting for, is $50,000. This is across your slate of grants. You want to do that with every single grant. So I was just working with them on starting to try to assign probabilities to whether they thought they would get a grant or not, so that they could start to be better around their budgeting. So they weren't guessing as much at what their budget was. But what's interesting about that is that what happens is that it actually motivates you to look under the hood more on the winning side, which I think is a problem that you just brought up, that is really a problem. It's like nobody kind of wants to dig in when they're winning. They don't, it's like they just want to bask in the glow of the winning. And God forbid, like you don't want to look under the hood there, right? Because you kind of don't want to rain on your own parade with a question about what you could be doing better when you can just sort of bask in your own glory. But because I got ASAS to really be thinking about how do you refine your estimates of the probability of getting a grant, what ended up happening was that when they were awarded a grant, which they didn't used to do, they would go back to the grantor, and they would actually ask about the, sort of what the chance, why did they get the grant? How close were they? Were they like on the edge, or were they a sure thing? What could they do better in the future in terms of the grant writing process and so on and so forth, because they wanted to be able to go in and refine their guesses. And in order to do that, they have to go talk to grants, to places where they get the grants as well as places where they don't. So they used to circle back to the ones where they didn't get the grant, but they hadn't previously been circling back to the ones where they did actually get awarded the grant. But that information is very valuable. It's particularly valuable to know, because what you don't want to do is say, well, I got the grant, so obviously like I was guaranteed, like I just did a really good job. Because it may be when you call them back, they may be, well, you were right on the edge, and it happened that like there was one little thing that kind of like flipped you over to yes versus no, but you were almost as likely to get a no as a yes. That's like really valuable information. So I think that when you start getting your mind to, I really want to understand what the process is. And in order to understand what the process is, I start to have to think about these things probabilistically and try to start refining my guesses about what the right decision is. Then you start to kind of divorce yourself from what the quality of the outcome is, because the goal is no longer to have a short-term good outcome. The goal is now to have a great conversation with Eric Seidel. And in order to do that, you've got to be digging in on the win side and the loss side as much as possible. And that's where you're sort of getting your reward from now. That's where, if you go back to Kahneman, it's not like you're giving up that idea that I'm going to have a positive update to myself narrative. It's that what's triggering the positive update is now different. So
it's learning. What's learning is learning and mastery. That's what's triggering the positive narrative and not results.
Once Eric did that, once Eric really had that sort of like really blunt, sort of harsh conversation with me, what ended up happening was that the thought that I might just be like moaning about a hand was so, became so awful to me that was actually a negative update, right? It no longer created a positive update for me of just, well, if I can offload it to luck, then I'll feel better about myself. Now, because of what Eric had sort of contractually done with me, if I offloaded it to luck, I kind of just felt bad. And when I went up and said, you know what, I think I really butchered this hand, the ability to that I could go up and say that to him now became part of the positive update. So it just kind of changes. It changes sort of how you feel about process. Like how is it that you're sort of deriving that feeling that you're a good actor?
And here's, personal growth people have been saying that when you're in victim mode, as you are when you're just the poor you luck, you have no power in the situation. But if you're self-aware and self-diagnosing, you recover your power. And yes, luck was a factor in this, but now you're sort of taking responsibility for what you're able to take responsibility, which is your decisions and your choices. And, the chips will fall where they may. And I think that's people talk about that in Stoicism or in sort of modern skepticism, modern Stoicism, as something as being philosophical about the results, as we can only, all we can do is make good choices. And then, in life, the chips will fall where they may. You practice on the golf course as hard as you will. And if it hits a sprinkler head, as you use another sports metaphor in your book, that's just one of those things. It doesn't devalue the effort that you put into your game or your overall excellence as a golfer.
Right. Ray Dalio talks about swings versus shots, right? Is that you want to care about the swing. You care about the swing, which I think is also a nice,
Oh, it is nice. It is nice.
Metaphor. People will say to me, oh, but Annie, if you embrace uncertainty in this way, if you're saying like there's luck in every outcome and you really don't have control over the luck element, then how do you ever decide anything? Like, don't you end up in decision paralysis? And I actually say no, that it's
quite the opposite.
That what causes us to be paralyzed in our decision is feeling like we can guarantee that somehow if we just did more work or we did more research, that we could guarantee the way that things are going to turn out. But that's not true. Like Pete Carroll had a 1%er hit. It's like one time out of 100, that result is going to happen. And so look, that's about as close to certain as you're going to get about anything. It's like 99 times it's going to be like dropped or, caught for a touchdown. And then 1% of the time you're going to have a bad outcome. So I think the idea that we want to know how things are going to go, that we want to be able to guarantee a good result. And we're so afraid of the result being bad, and that somehow that's going to cause us emotional distress. That's what causes decision paralysis, that we feel like we have to keep gathering information and keep asking people and keep going, as opposed to just saying, well, I can't really guarantee the way the future turns out because there's always more possibilities for the future than the one that will actually happen, right? So, and that's always going to be the case. So I have to now I'm willing to say, well, at this point, I don't think new information is going to substantially reverse the decision that I'm going to make, right? Anything that I do beyond this point, having gathered the information that I have and talked to the people that I have, is only going to sort of refine the probabilities of which future I think will occur. But I think I've got a pretty good idea of which future is going to occur. And I'm pretty sure that given the information I have, that I've got the one that I want at a high enough probability that I'm just going to go ahead with it. Because I know
that's so funny. I was coaching a guy. Yeah, I was coaching a guy who's thinking of starting a company, and he'd been a career executive, very successful tech exec, and thinking of going out on his own. And I kept asking him, like, he kept putting off this decision almost a year. And in the tech market, that's a long, long time in a fast-moving tech market. And I said, what new information would affect your decision? And it wasn't that he was waiting for new information or new data or, new market analysis or something like that. He was a naturally sort of risk-averse guy, and he just couldn't, we discussed it at length. It's like, you might fail, pal. You do know that, good as you are, you may think, but all you can do is we're going to make the best decision we can and see where the chips fall. But eventually didn't. But I mean, it was very hard for him to grok that, you might well fail at this. And, that's just the way these things go. So it's interesting. And I think it's quite freeing. And the existentialists talk about we're doomed to choose, that's all we can do.
I think what Jeff Bezos, I think, says, like, he's got like that 70% rule. Like once you're sort of like 70% of the way there, just go ahead and do it. Because, and the other thing that I think is really important for people who get into that sense of like, well, I need to know for sure before I make a decision, is that not making a decision is a decision.
That's another very good thing.
Yeah, you're deciding to stay with the status quo. So how sure are you that that's the best choice? Why don't you think about that? Because maybe, and I think that that's also a really big problem, is that people think that when you have some change, like your guy who's like, well, maybe I'm going to do this startup, not doing the startup is a decision as well. Like sticking with the status quo, that's also a decision.
You're channeling Nietzsche. You're channeling Nietzsche there. Not to decide is to decide. I think you're
not to decide is to decide.
Yeah, so that's cool. Well, look, you and I could go on for another 3-4 hours, no doubt.
Me too.
We could. It's kind of cool. So I want people to be able to track you down. So your nonprofit work, I mean, I know you've been involved in Anti-Up for Africa. That was a remarkable project with Don Cheadle, raised $4 million for people for whom $4 million makes a big difference. You've been involved in a number of things, but now what are you up to in the nonprofit sphere? Where can they find you? But also, where can people, where can people find you if they want to pay you $50,000 for a talk?
Sure. So then I co-founded a nonprofit. It's called How I Decide. People can find us at howidecide.org. And what we do is it's sort of twofold. We create programs and curricula to try to develop decision-making and critical thinking skills in youth, with a particular focus on underserved youth.
Yep.
Really kind of serving the whole decision ecosystem, all the way from decision fitness, which would be more in the mindfulness category, to habit formation, to probabilistic thinking, which we actually teach through fantasy football, getting people to start to really think probabilistically and about biases. And
you and your sports.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like go to where the kids are, and this gives us a chance to people about, overconfidence and, the Dunning-Kruger effect and bandwagoning, self-serving bias. So it's a way to really kind of teach people about biases in the way that you're interpreting your results in uncertain systems. So the kids seem to like it, and we really like that program. So that's one thing we do. And the other thing we're doing is really trying to work on being field catalysts. So get different people from disparate areas to start talking to each other about how we get more energy around this idea that rationality is really important and that we need to start making that a focus of education. So hopefully people will go to howidecide.org and explore there. If you want to donate, we would love that. But also if you just, want to spread the word, just getting people to pay attention to this is obviously really important. So very excited about that nonprofit. In terms of me, there's 3 different ways that you can connect with me. The first is go to my website, annieduke.com. There's a contact form there, and you can inquire about hiring me there, or you can just reach out and tell me what you think, what you're thinking about, what if you come across material that you think would be interesting to me. A lot of my best material comes from readers where they just kind of point me in the direction. So, for example, a reader wrote me a few weeks ago pointing out a speech that Madeleine Albright had given, saying that people thought that diplomacy was a lot like chess, but it really wasn't like chess at all. She said it was more like billiards, but she was trying to point out that there's this random element.
Yep.
And that was wonderful. And I ended up writing about that because that came from a reader. So I really love hearing from readers and what readers are thinking about, but also you can hire me there. The other thing you can do at annieduke.com is see archives of my newsletter, which goes out every Friday. And if you like it, you can subscribe there to the newsletter, and in your inbox, you'll get content from me every Friday, which is really on, decision-making, critical thinking, particularly tolerance of dissent, which I think is really important for good decision-making. So I think the Madeleine Albright bit ended up in my newsletter. And then the other thing that you can do is go to at Annie Duke, because I am actually very active on Twitter, and I post a lot to Twitter, articles that I've come across, quotes that I think are interesting, point people to other thinkers in this space that I think they should be following, and that kind of thing. And I really do love hearing from people. The feedback is incredibly helpful for me.
Yeah, it's cool. So we got annieduke.com, we've got the newsletter, and we've got signed up, and you can also get in a dialogue with you about, topics du jour, things that are important in life, and similarly on Twitter. That's really excellent. I do want to say to readers before we just check out, there's some stuff that Annie and I didn't get to talk about. And she and I have been going a mile a minute here for an hour. So you don't want to miss the middle of Annie's book, listeners, which is when she talks about the historical tradition of the Supreme Court, which was to hire clerks who were of an opposite political persuasion. As one conservative justice that you name in the book, Annie said, I can handle the conservative stuff myself. I don't need that. I don't need people to stoke that. I need left-leaning clerks, and how that culture seems to have shifted, and clerks, Supreme Court justices now tend to hire clerks who reinforce their ideological biases. And that's an interesting thing, but I don't want listeners or people who buy Annie's book to miss that really important stuff, because Annie doesn't get very political in the book, but there's certainly enough in here that's relevant for political choices here. I want people to be aware. This is not just, again, a poker book by any stretch. In fact, poker's really a sidelight in it, something like that. It's really useful for political decision-making. It's good for consumer choices. It's good for particularly choices as a business leader. It's good for decision-making in teams. It's good for learning. It's good for understanding groupthink. It's good for understanding cognitive biases. And it's good for understanding how to, as Annie titled the book really beautifully, how to think in bets. So definitely want to get onto that. And Annie, I want to thank you. One other thing I want to thank you for is you mentioned my favorite documentary of all time in the book. Which one do you think that is?
Favorite documentary?
My favorite documentary of all time. And you, Annie Duke, mentioned it in your book. It's pretty early, too. My favorite documentary of all time.
Pretty early in the book I mentioned it?
Really early. Von Neumann. Well,
yeah. Well, so yes. So John von Neumann is absolutely. He wrote a book called The Theory of Games, so he's the father of modern game theory, which is really decision making under conditions of uncertainty when there's multiple people involved. So for people who don't know,
here's the daddy of all this stuff.
He ran our Cold War strategy, but people also don't know about him that he's the father of the modern computer.
Yes, indeed.
And that he ran the Manhattan Project. So, I mean, this guy is like an amazing guy. And what I think is really incredible about him is that he's so important in the history of science, and yet nobody knows who he is. So,
super duper geek.
Yeah. So, right. So, generally, like I'll get up in front of audiences where, there's 1,000 people in the audience, and I'll say, does anybody know who John von Neumann is? And I might have one little hand go up over in the corner.
Yeah.
Now, when John Nash, who people are more familiar with, was his student. When I say John Nash, I'll get, maybe 25% of the room will raise their hand. And then when I ask who Russell Crowe is.
Because Russell Crowe, right?
Then everybody puts their hand up as soon as I say Russell Crowe.
But it was The Ascent of Man. You talked about The Ascent of Man, which was I watched in 1972 with my parents, which is my favorite documentary of all time. It's a history of science, and I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes. And for me, that makes you a remarkable person if you like the same.
Oh, well, thank you. And just one of the reasons, so the thing that I pull from that, which I think is people should go listen, is, Jacob Bronowski recounting this conversation that he had with him, which really gets to the core of what I'm talking about in the book, where I'm going to paraphrase, but he basically said to von Neumann, I've read The Theory of Games, which, just not to leave Oscar Morgenstern out, Oscar Morgenstern was the co-author on that. But he said, I've read The Theory of Games and it's very interesting, but how come you didn't base this game theory on chess? And von Neumann's response, and this is a real paraphrase, was chess is not a game, it's a calculation. Poker is a game. And what he meant by that is because in chess you can see all the pieces and you don't have the same luck element involved, that you can calculate out the game to the end if you had enough computing power. So I can just see the board. And so whatever move I make, I know what all the possible responses that you can make back are, and so on and so on and so forth down into the game. So it's really just becomes a mathematical calculation at that point. He said the reason why I used poker as the model for game theory is because you have the hidden cards. So you don't know what all the possible responses are. And then you have this element of luck where you don't know, which cards are going to come. And he said that's just a much better model for modeling human decision-making. And that comes from that documentary. And it's a quote from Jacob Bronowski. So, I wish everybody would go study von Neumann.
And life is, and I'm sure all listeners will resonate with this, life is a game of imperfect information. You don't get to know how the movie ends. You don't know all the variables and how they're saying. And so, I think there's lots of wisdom and, psychological wisdom. And so I'm a big fan. I want to leave you with one question.
Okay.
Best TV show right now for binging, go.
Oh, for binging.
Yeah. Best bingeable TV
so
right now.
I'm gonna pick a show that has a lot of seasons because I think that with binging you want a lot of seasons.
You do. You want like a good 7-season thing, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So for binging, I'm gonna say The Americans.
Oh, so with you. Oh my God.
Because they're finishing season 5, so like there's a lot to watch there. I mean, Westworld is great, but they've only, they're only starting season 2, and same thing like Handmaid's Tale, which is amazing, but it's only one season. Like I like binging. Like I waited on Breaking Bad.
Yeah,
I started watching it when it was already done, and I binged it over the course of about a month. 5 seasons of Breaking Bad, and that's the way I like to do it. So because it's got a lot of content, I'm going to say The Americans right now.
Yeah, I love The Americans, and I also get Kerry Russell out of The Americans, which for an old man like myself is, anyway.
Yeah,
I don't know if there's similar asset for women who might watch the show. Very good show, very, very good. Annie, it's been a pleasure. I'm going to end it there. Thank you for your time so much.
Thank you. This has been a fun conversation.
Hey, and this is the part of the show where I get to talk about popular culture and some books that you will find interesting. The podcast is now approaching its 6-month birthday, and there's so many interesting people to talk to in the world, and so spoiled. I wish I had do I really wish this? I don't know if I wish this. I wish I could do this twice a week rather than once every 2 weeks, but I'm still forging the path of writing Truth Wars, and I still do some consulting and teaching on the side. So the podcast is still only once every 2 weeks. I'm loving doing it. I'm loving your support. Thank you. We've got now, I think we're approaching 6,000 listeners, which is, great from a start of 0 in December. So I'm thrilled. I'm really, really very thankful for your support. Please share and contribute. Challenge my guests and me. Make this your podcast. Tell me who I should invite. Share in the show notes any great shows or music you find interesting. Let me talk about some books that are very similar to Annie's. Two authors, Nassim Taleb and Nate Silver. Nassim Taleb has three, he's got more, but there are three sort of signature books by Nassim Taleb that I think are must-reads for business people. One of them is Fooled by Randomness. One of them is called The Black Swan. And one of them, which is kind of a summative book, is called Anti-Fragile. They're among his most memorable. Probably no other writer has done more to bring cognitive science and decision-making under uncertainty to the public eye, except for perhaps Dan Kahneman. Taleb is funny, acerbic, and profoundly insightful. I'm still going to try and get him on the show, despite his elusiveness. You'll find links to those books in the show notes. The other is by 538 founder Nate Silver, and it's called The Signal and the Noise, perhaps more accessible than the Taleb books, although the Taleb books are pretty accessible. Nate's book is more so, again, trying to get him on the podcast. He's had a transformative effect on our culture. He, too, coincidentally, made his living as a poker player for a few years. He made his living for a while as a professional sports bettor. So he understands the real lived world of decision-making under uncertainty and decision-making in probabilistic environments. So 4 books, and again, find the links in the show notes. On the culture front, well, I'm still trying to figure out what to think about Infinity Wars. I'm addicted to The Americans and Homeland, and I'm not really sure about season 2 of Westworld yet. Share any shows that you find interesting in the show notes. And that is all for this week. I want to thank you once again for listening, and thank you for your contributions and your support. And I look forward to talking to you again in a couple of weeks. Thank you. To celebrate the launch of the show, and thank you all for listening, I'm going to be giving away books. Lots and lots of books. All you have to do is leave a review in iTunes. We're going to raffle off a book every single week for 12 weeks. So head on over to paulgibbons.net/iTunes to get easy-to-follow directions and let me know the title of your review to make sure that you're entered to win. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Think Bigger, Think Better. Great ideas are great, but this isn't gospel. Share your critical thinking in the comments. Where do I disagree? What insights were most powerful? If you got value, don't forget to share the value by sharing the podcast. Finally, to get information on book and blog releases and new video content, head over to paulgibbons.net and join the community of thinkers talking about using science and philosophy to make our world a better place.